It all started with a very simple idea. Tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them. So thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. My guest today is CEO Ralph Taylor. Ralph is Chief Executive Officer at Sysmex America and is responsible for the day-to-day management and strategy for the entire region. Prior to joining Sysmex, Ralph served as Vice President of Cellular Analysis Strategic Marketing at Beckman Coulter, formerly the Coulter Corporation, where he worked for 19 years. He holds a graduate management degree from the University of Greenwich and an undergraduate degree in medical laboratory sciences from Paddington College, both in London. Ralph Taylor, welcome into the corner office.
Thank you, Brant. Glad to be here.
Wonderful to have you here, and great that we could hear a little bit about your journey. It's been very interesting reading your bio and getting to know a little bit about you. What we like to do is kind of start a little bit about the early years of each CEO. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what your early family life was like.
Yeah, you will most likely detect from my accent, I actually am English by birth. I grew up in the Greater London suburbs in an area or a county called Essex, and the town I grew up in was Romford in Essex. That was sort of through my early years, I stayed and perhaps was a little bit different from a lot of perhaps some of your listeners, where I didn't leave home, in fact, until the day I got married. But grew up in a family environment through high school. Then my career sort of took a slightly different path, because I went from high school straight into a working environment, and then after getting married, I then moved to the county of Kent, which is classed as the Garden of England, for a number of years. And then with job moves, ended up moving to a town in more north of London called Luton, which was where I moved from. I made really my major career move, which was from working in the National Health Service to moving into the commercial sector of the health service industry.
Well, we'll want to get to that in a minute, but I want to focus a little bit on the earlier days. Sounds like you had a pretty close family life, certainly a supportive one, staying at home until you actually got married. Brothers and sisters, were you a single child? What was your sibling situation?
I had a brother an elder brother and an elder sister. I was perhaps the fortunate one, being the younger of
the
three.
Baby, yeah. I am one of those too, Ralph. I know what that's like.
My brother and sister would tell you I was the one that was spoiled and always got my way.
I've heard that before.
But we all actually lived with my parents, and I think all of us as a family, both my brother and sister, were living at home until they got married. So we had a sort of close family unit. My father worked in the printing industry, which obviously has changed significantly with the advent of computerization impacting the print industry, but he left and was a big influence on me. He left school during really the sort of latter or towards the end of the Second World War, and he left school as a 14-year-old and went to work into an apprenticeship with a company that was at that time called the Solicitors Law Stationery Society, which was a legal and financial printers. And he went from sweeping the floors as a warehouseman when he first entered serving an apprenticeship. And the company evolved and was bought by the British Printing Corporation, and they became the largest city and financial printers in Europe. And they evolved to a company called Oye Press, which still exists today. But he rose from a warehouseman to the managing director of the organization. And in a way, he sort of showed me or made me aware that if you set your sights and your ambitions, you can achieve and reach those goals. It takes hard work and it takes focus. But in a way, that was sort of, for me, a role model in terms of, saying that if you set a goal and you focus on that goal can be realized. And so that was sort of quite a big influence on me.
Was mom stay at home? Did she focus on the kids?
Yeah, mum was stay at home. She most likely had the most important job, taking care of the three of us and making sure we followed the rules. But it was that influence that sort of really is something that I've still used today and also instilled in my children in that sense.
What about school life? Were you a good student in school, Ralph?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we were exceptional. So let me rephrase that. I wouldn't say I was exceptional, but we were good students. I enjoyed school and valued education. I think for me, I found that the areas I loved was science, the sciences, biology, chemistry, and physics, particularly biology. And that's what started to influence where I would make my early steps in my career and sort of going out from schooling. And that's, in fact, why I left school at high school level rather than going into a university, because I left and went into train as a biomedical scientist at St Thomas's Hospital in London, which was, if people know London well, it's the very, very big teaching hospital, one of the biggest teaching hospitals in London, on the River Thames, right opposite the Houses of Parliament. And I went in there from high school and then spent the next 8 years training to be
it was kind of a vocational stream, basically, into the sciences.
Yeah, so it was 2 nights and a full day a week that was sponsored by the National Health Service for 8 years, and through that process, I obtained a degree and then did postgraduate qualifications in health service management.
Did you work along the way, Ralph? I know growing up in England's a little different and in Europe in general than, in the U.S. Typically kids will do entrepreneurial things like handling paper routes or, selling cards at Christmas and so forth. But I'm sure you had to help pay the bills, if not pay them yourself. What type of jobs?
My parents sort of instilled in me that if you want something, then save up for it. In that sense, that mentality. And so early on, I think like most children, I started off with a paper round, delivering newspapers, and then graduated from that to working on believe it or not, a street market. And I worked on a very famous street market in London called Petticoat Lane, which is I worked for a company that sold sort of teenager fashion items cheaply. So we sort of reproduced fashionable current fashions, particularly for girls, but that were affordable. And I worked for that for 2 years. But I must be honest, standing outside when it was snowing all day long was not for me. And then I progressed to working in a do-it-yourself shop as a salesman within a do-it-yourself shop, and I worked alongside my brother there while he was going through he actually went to university to train as a civil engineer, and we worked there from after school. I used to work there for a couple of hours, closing the shop in the evenings, and then on Saturday, all day Saturday. But it was something that for me again it was part of something that my parents instilled in me, that if you want things and you set your goals for things, you have to work for them, and I had to work for things and save for them. If I like many youngsters, I had a dream of being a rock star, and I wanted to buy an electric guitar and become a famous rock star. I then part of my objective was I was working to save to buy that. After buying it, I found out I was tone deaf. So
oh goodness,
was a very short-lived rock star career.
I can imagine. So after the vocational training, did you go at one point in time and back and get your university degree, or did you go right into the workforce following that?
Right into the workforce, because I obtained my degree through the vocational training. It was an outside program. So I obtained the degree through going to basically night school and school at weekends while working in the National Health Service as a biomedical technician. And it was a requirement to gain promotion within that structure of biomedical sciences. But for me, it was good because it appealed to me because of my love of biology, and I went to work in a hematology lab. So the lab part of diagnostic testing that does the blood tests and looks at your white blood count, hemoglobin, and red count, and whether you're anemic. And it was an area I found fascinating. The study of blood and its impact on the human body, and the disease was related to the body through things like leukemia and things like that, and meeting patients and working with patients. I love doing, I had a fabulous time, and my career today, is still related to that industry. And it allows me to go back into laboratories, and it's a great opportunity for me to go back and still see how people practice hematology laboratory work. It's changed greatly from when I was in the laboratory, but it's great, and I still enjoy it. I still love looking at a blood film and looking at blood cells and counting blood cells.
When did you move into leadership responsibilities?
It first started when I was working in laboratories. After I gained my first degree, it allowed me to be promoted to a senior medical laboratory technician, and that gave me the responsibility, more I would class it as sort of supervisory responsibilities of an area of the laboratory, and there I would be take on supervisory responsibilities for 5 or 6 medical laboratory technicians, and basically working through how we would manage all the testing that was coming in that day through the hospital and all of the outpatient services. And obviously we had turnaround times we had to commit to for particularly areas like the intensive care unit to make sure their results were getting back on time. So started to take sort of that supervisory stroke managerial responsibilities there of managing a team of 5 to 6 people. And that was as a sort of an 18, 19-year-old.
Wow, very young. What were some of the earliest leadership lessons you learned from that job?
For me, I think my first lesson was that learning how people respond to your actions and how they mirror your actions. And I found by working with people and setting an example, and it's been a philosophy I've always adopted. I will never ask anybody to do something, even today as a CEO, I will never ask anybody to do anything I'm not prepared to do myself. And I found, if I set that example, people were willing to follow. And I found that something that was important to me early on as from managing people. And it's something that I've always kept true to one of my core philosophies throughout my whole career.
Any best or worst lessons from previous bosses? And you don't have to mention any names, Ralph.
I think I think as opposed to one of the things I have learned is that the biggest variable within any level of management are people. And you have to treat people differently. And they all have different trigger points, and they all have points that excite them and motivate them, and other factors that demotivate them. And I think one of the things I've learned was the most from previous managers was that intimidation doesn't always work to get people going. And get people motivated to do things. I have found it and it's again a lesson that I've adopted and an approach I use where...
Did you have former bosses like that, Ralph, that tried to intimidate or try to lead you by intimidation?
Yes. And for me, I found that was more of a negative switch than a positive switch in terms of motivation. And I found that I didn't react to it. In fact, it was my approach to it was I would wait till things had calmed down and then have a more meaningful discussion on what was required and what we were looking to achieve. So I felt that that's one of the practices I learned from a sort of bad manager. Also, the fact of planning and how key planning is to being successful. And if you're not planning properly, you're not looking out with enough timelines and bringing vision back to your team, you're not going to move your team forward, and you're not going to get the leadership that you're looking for.
So track your career a little bit. So NHS, where you did your training, did you go into the private sector following that? How did you kind of transition, in leadership positions there, and then eventually make it over to the U.S.?
Yeah, no, I after getting various promotions within the National Health Service, I applied for what at that time was the highest level a medical laboratory scientist could achieve within the national healthcare structure, which was to be the manager of all of the diagnostic labs. At that time, I was 29, and so I applied for the position. I didn't get the particular position I applied for, but I was fortunate enough to be able to know two of the interview panel. And I asked them for direct feedback and said, where did I go wrong? And they said, the feedback I got was you actually interviewed very, very well, and you were a very strong candidate. The thing that worked against you was the point that you just raised was my age.
You're too young.
And they said, you're too young. You're going to be managing people that are 50 and 55. And there was a concern that would be a problem in the labs. So that gave me a sort of pause for thought, and I began to question, at 29, could I go further? How would my career look for the next 25, 30 years? So I started to think about different options that may be open to me. And at that time, a company called Coulter Electronics, which was the world leader in blood cell counting, contacted me and said, we have a position in our organization that we'd like you to consider.
And they were a privately held
privately held American
right?
company.
American company.
Yeah, privately held American company, and they were the world leader in blood cell counting. They actually created the company was run by two brothers, the Coulter brothers, Wallace and Joe Coulter, and Wallace Coulter founded a principle called the Coulter Principle. And it really founded an industry and revolutionized hematology blood cell counting in hospitals. But they were the world leader. They approached me and asked if I would consider joining them as a specialist that could advise customers on techniques and applications. And I felt this was an opportunity to move to the commercial side of healthcare. And I was very matter of fact. I discussed it with my wife, and we both felt that this was an opportunity. And if it didn't work out, I could always fall back on my career as a medical laboratory technician and go back into the health service. So after discussions with my wife, we felt that it was worth taking that chance and that opportunity. So I joined the Coulter Electronics, which was part of Coulter Corporation here in the US. It was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Coulter Corporation of America. And I worked for them as an applications specialist.
Did you move to the U.S. at that time, or? No,
that was when I made the move to Luton, where their offices were. The operation based in the United Kingdom was responsible for all of Europe through really as far as China in terms of its operation. And I worked for them and moved into a marketing position and worked in their marketing position. And then I eventually moved into, still based out of the United Kingdom, managing all of their distributor relations in Scandinavia. So I was looking after Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland as a territory. And that was an interesting time to travel into Scandinavia and work closely with distributors and make sure that they were driving the Coulter business and making sure that the Coulter products were top of mind with their organization, their sales force. And I was then, while I was managing that, I was asked if I would take over the territories for the Mediterranean territory. And I was offered a move to go to live in Athens in Greece and manage all of the Greek islands and all of the islands down the Mediterranean, which from a lifestyle perspective
that sounded very attractive.
Was most likely it was very attractive, and my wife, 30s. and my wife was very supportive of a move, we always had discussed we'd like to go and live and work in another country and see whether it was something we could do. And we were following that process, and then I got literally a call from the Coulter Corporation, and was asked whether I'd consider moving to Florida, Miami, Florida, and come to the corporate head office. And it was strange because I went home that evening and I said to my wife, "Oh, I got a call from the head office today, and they asked whether I'd be interested to go and work in the US." And I said to my wife, it's most likely one of those sort of calls where people are just sounding you out and nothing will happen from it. I went into the office the next day where there was an email waiting for me that said, there's a ticket for you. Can you fly out on Saturday to meet with us? And so I went back to my wife that night and said, that call I had, which I didn't take too seriously. Well, actually, it's quite serious. They've asked me to go to Florida on Saturday, and I came out to Florida. We spoke about the opportunity. It was again in marketing, supporting all of the existing products for hematology from the Coulter Corporation, and I felt that the opportunity of moving to a corporate head office from a career perspective would open many avenues for me, far more than being a territory manager based in the Greek islands. So I just felt this was a much stronger career move. And also, coming to Florida for someone from the United Kingdom, we'd visited
the land of eternal sunshine.
Yeah, it's an eternal sunshine. We'd visited Disney World as a family. So we sort of knew what we were walking into, and also language was going to be much easier. We still, there's the old saying of two countries separated by a common language, but from a language perspective, and we felt for our children, the integration and putting them in schools and everything else would be a much easier transition. And it was not an easy decision to move to America. From a close family unit, one of the things I'd always been brought up with was from a philosophy of my father was that family comes first. And the close unit of a family is very important. But both my parents were incredibly supportive and thought it was a great opportunity, and felt that the decision we'd made to move to the US was the right decision. And it was most likely one of the toughest days of my life was when I walked into Heathrow Airport with a one-way ticket for my wife and two children, and sort of, you sort of check in and there's no return flight in front of you, and it was like, this is real. We're doing this. We're going. But
well, it sounds like no looking back. You've been in the States since then, from what I gather.
Yeah, we moved over in 1996. The move was incredibly easy for the whole family, and never looked back in that sense. And we've loved.
Now, was Sysmex your first CEO position, or were you in a CEO role prior to?
No, within the Coulter Corporation, I rose to the position. Coulter Corporation, I was here they were privately owned, and I was here with them for 2 years, and then they were acquired by a company called Beckman, which were another diagnostics company based on the West Coast that made clinical chemistry analyzers. And a gentleman called Arnold O. Beckman is very famous because he invented the pH meter. He actually invented it for his friend who wanted to test the acidity of lemons and oranges for the citrus industry. But he created this whole business, family-owned independent business on the West Coast, and they acquired the Coulter Corporation, where the two Coulter brothers became elderly and ill, and one of them passed away. But to form a company called Beckman Coulter, which is now owned by Danaher Corporation. But I got to the level of vice president of strategic marketing for their cellular analysis division. So my job was running a team of people, primarily marketing people, product management, but building all of the 5 and 10 year plans for the cell analysis business globally. And so looking at where we needed to be as a company, where we felt the lab testing business was moving, and how we needed to meet those needs 5 and 10 years out. And it was a great time. It afforded me many opportunities. And one of the things I've been very lucky with both companies was the ability to travel all over the world and travel to many countries I never dreamed I'd ever visit. So that. And
then did you rise to the executive suite in that organization?
Yes, I was in the cell analysis division. Was in the executive suite there, and Sysmex was at that time the major competitor of Beckman Coulter particularly in the hematology field, and the current then CEO of Sysmex America, who had also moved over from the United Kingdom, had contacted me on a number of occasions and said, you should come and join Sysmex. And I kept saying, no, I'm very happy where I am. And then one day he phoned me up, a gentleman called John Kershaw, and said, I don't want you to say anything. Will you come and meet me for dinner? And I said, yeah, sure. We'd been, England's a small country the size of Florida, so we'd known each other. And in the industry, you would stop and have a coffee with them and
run into each other.
Right, yeah, and talk about trends and things that were happening. And he said to me, he said, you've declined coming to Sysmex before. I have an opportunity that I really want you to come and do for us. And I'd like you to think about it. And it's all about timing. And I felt it was perhaps time. I felt that I had reached a point within the Beckman Coulter organization where I wasn't going to move any further. And I also felt that they'd changed some of their focus in the area of the business that I was working in. And I felt that Sysmex were investing and driving into the area of the business that I was very passionate about. And so I decided at that time it was the right time, that offer at that time, it was time to make a move. I'll be very honest with you. I'd always thought I would retire with Beckman Coulter.
Stay with them.
Yeah.
Well, what did he offer you? Did he offer you to come and take his job over, or what?
It was to take over all of the marketing and business development for the Americas, so Canada, US, and all of Latin America and Brazil and the Caribbean islands. And a slight change from to a more what I would class as a tactical marketing role, which I felt was a new challenge for myself. But he also painted a vision of where Sysmex was heading, where they wanted me to play a role in that vision, and it was very appealing to me, and I felt it was the right time to make that move.
And it sounds like you eventually succeeded him.
Yeah, and so I joined the Sysmex organization. By that time, Sysmex had grown to be the number one in a number of fields of diagnostic testing, and I worked through the organization and took on the role of executive vice president for Latin America and took over responsibility for all of the business in our LATAM operations, which was a great challenge again to move into looking after the Latin American business, working with direct and distributor businesses, a great growth opportunity. And then John was making a move to a role within the corporate head offices over in Kobe, Japan. So the corporation asked me whether I would be interested in being considered for the CEO position, and it was obviously, the goal I'd set out to be, and where my focus was. So it was again, I think, like everything in life, sometimes timing works, and you get there through hard work and having the right skill sets, but also sometimes timing helps you.
A little bit of luck and timing helps. And you've been CEO for how many years now, Ralph?
I've been CEO at Sysmex America, Inc. for 2 years now.
2 years. And you were there previously for how many years before you moved into that role?
Yeah, I've been with the Sysmex Corporation now for 11 years. So
for 11 years, yeah.
Yeah, so I was in the other positions for 9 years, the marketing, and then through looking after all the LATAM operations.
So looking at your time at Sysmex specifically, good long decade there, a little bit plus. How would you say your leadership style has evolved from the time that you came in, from a competitor, obviously at the request of the CEO, and moved into, it sounds like, at least 2 or 3 pretty interesting jobs to the corner office. Would you say there's been some evolution of your leadership during that period?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my first role was more driving, and leadership was driving from a action-based responsibilities to obviously moving to a CEO role where being much more looking at the longer term vision. So I was looking at short-term actions, short-term goals and growth, and moving into a CEO role where I was now looking at much longer, long-term growth, long-term vision and position for Sysmex Americas going forward, and how we grow, and looking and seeing how to grow and evolve our operations across all of the Americas.
What about building a company culture? What are your thoughts about that? Is there a fairly well-established culture that you inherited that you are continuing to kind of propagate, or do you feel that it's the CE's role to kind of make some minor changes and set new directions?
Yeah, I feel firstly, culture is extremely important to an organization. Sysmex as a company has a corporate culture called the Sysmex Way, and that's the core values that Sysmex has as a company that's global, and it becomes the key central point for all of the organization. And we feel, and I feel in particular, it's what makes Sysmex unique as a company. We're very fortunate. We have staff that join Sysmex, and they're long-time staff. Our turnover is very, very low, and part of that is the values the company has in terms of its value and commitment to healthcare and shaping and advancing healthcare, but also the core values it has to its employees, and in terms of how we grow and develop our employees and support them in the organization. And it's something that as an organization we discuss. We encourage management to discuss it on a regular basis through staff meetings. We do it through group town hall meetings, and discuss what the Sysmex Way means to people. And like any culture, people have their slight and very different tweaks on what that means to them personally. But we have this core culture, and I would sum it up. It's a very caring culture as an organization, not in two levels, to our customers, but also to our employees, and going the extra mile. And if you see an employee that's struggling, reach down and help them and bring them up. It's the values that are instilled in our employees is that you should be, if you want to grow and develop in the organization, that's one of the core values we look for, is how people go that extra mile and support the not only customers but also everybody within the organization.
Well, I like that high investment in people. Again, the business I'm in with recruiting, and I'll tell you the value that we add isn't so much finding the people that have the resume depth. It's those folks that really do fit the culture. It's just so important. Any recruiter can probably find 100, if not 1,000 resumes that may match a certain job spec, but really understanding what goes on the inside. And to that point, if you only had a few minutes to interview someone, what kind of questions do you ask them? If let's say it's not so much a direct report, but maybe somebody deeper in your organization.
When I'm looking for someone, one of the key, obviously, to get to the interviews level, I make I'll make an assumption that they've got the core skills and requisites to fill the position. So I'm looking for how the person fits within the organization, and are they a right fit for Sysmex as a company. And so I always ask every person I've ever interviewed, and it stemmed from a question someone asked me, so I won't take credit for it, but I always ask them that after I've interviewed them, if there's only one thing I remember from the whole interview, what would that one thing be? What was the one thing that you would want me to remember about that person? And it's very telling how, because in a way I'm allowing someone to give them sort of like a 4-minute elevator, the 4-minute elevator speech on how they perceive themselves as a person. Because I always state, and I don't tell me you're the right person for the job. What's that one thing you want me to remember about, like, Brant as an individual?
What are some of the best answers you've received on that? That's a great question.
I had a number of very good ones. One of the ones I liked personally the most is that someone came back to me and talked about how, and they picked up where, and I gave them credit because they picked up what I was looking for. They talked about how they would fit into the organization and how they felt that they were the right fit for Sysmex on a personal level. So very quickly they picked up what I was looking for and responded back and sort of sold themselves in terms of, not only do I have the skill sets, I've got all of the right attributes and have the same core values as your company. And that is one of the key areas. People come back with, things like, I have integrity, hard work. Those are the sort of things you expect.
Those are the givens.
Givens. Yeah. It's where someone really picks up and taps into the core values and how they align with the core values as Sysmex of a company. It also shows to me that they've done research on the company and its core values and sort of managed to find out about the Sysmex way and what it stands for and what it means to us as a company.
Well, Ralph Taylor, you've been very generous with your time. We do have one last question for you that we ask all our CEOs. And, we've got a lot of folks that are listening to this that are planning their own plot as it relates to their career. And many of them may be a decade or two behind you. What career and life advice would you give to someone who's got their own eyes on the corner office?
My first advice, and it would be never be afraid to make, it's a cliche, but never be afraid to make a mistake. Secondly, never believe that you know it all. And thirdly, and I've been very fortunate in my career, I've managed to work with some very, very talented people that have helped me grow and develop as an individual, and also helped me in my role be very successful in the role I've taken. And I think that goes to also, as you're working through your management teams, today at Sysmex, I am very fortunate to have a tremendous management team that work with me. And I use that word very carefully. I never say for me. And that's another important part of it. I don't see myself as a CEO as being any different to anybody else in the organization. It goes all the way back to the statement I made very early on. I wouldn't ask someone to do something I wouldn't be prepared to do myself. But, working very closely with people, understanding them, and also try to take a lesson and make I always ask myself the question, and again, people say that it's a cliche, but I do find it valuable. Every day on the drive home, I ask myself, what could I have done better today?
Like that.
It's a bit of a cliche, but it's a good point. I try and take.
Sometimes the simplest questions are the best.
Yeah, just a sort of quick lesson of what could I have done better? What did I learn today?
Ralph Taylor, thank you so much in sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.